Chapter 1. The Sky on Fire. Vance Harrison stood on the gravel lot of the regional switching station. Sweat stung his eyes. It was 90 degrees out, a typical July afternoon. He wiped his forehead with the back of a greasy leather glove. The deep hum of the massive transformers was a sound he had lived with for 20 years. It was the heartbeat of the electrical grid. Millions of volts of power flowed through the thick copper arteries all around him. It kept the city hospitals running. It kept the air conditioners humming in the sprawling suburbs. It kept the modern world alive. Then the heartbeat spiked. A high-pitched squeal tore through the heavy summer air. It was not a normal mechanical failure. It sounded like the metal itself was screaming in agony. Vance dropped his heavy steel wrench. It hit the gravel with a dull thud. He covered his ears with both hands. The sound drilled directly into his skull. He looked up at the massive steel transmission towers. The thick aluminum lines violently shook. Sparks showered down onto the dry brown grass below. He had seen arc flashes before. Those were dangerous, but they were localized. This was entirely different. The sparks were blinding white, cascading like waterfalls of pure fire from every single junction box. Then he looked higher. The sky was wrong. It was 2 in the afternoon. The blue expanse above him fractured into ribbons of neon green and bruised purple. An aurora borealis. In the middle of the day, in the middle of summer in the American South. The screeching abruptly stopped. A loud, heavy clunk echoed across the yard as the main breakers tripped in unison to protect the system. Then came the silence. It was heavy. It pressed against his eardrums. The giant cooling fans on the transformers spun down to a complete halt. The emergency backup diesel generators, which were programmed to kick on within 3 seconds of a fault, did absolutely nothing. Vance pulled his smartphone from his front pocket. The glass screen was dead black. He pressed the power button. Nothing happened. He held the button down for 10 solid seconds. The device was uncomfortably warm in his bare hand. It smelled faintly of melting plastic and burnt lithium. He tossed the useless block of glass and metal onto the gravel. He looked back at the sky. The unnatural colors shifted like oil floating on dark water. A deep, sinking feeling settled in his gut. His stomach twisted into a hard knot. He was a senior grid engineer. He knew exactly what an anomaly of this magnitude meant. The sun had just vomited a massive wave of electromagnetic energy directly at the Earth. An X-class coronal mass ejection. A solar storm so incredibly powerful, it acted like a global electromagnetic pulse. The grid was not just temporarily down. The grid was completely fried. Transformers, substations, relays, and every unprotected microchip in the hemisphere were now nothing more than dead scrap metal. A shadow passed over him. Vance looked toward the eastern horizon. A commercial Boeing passenger jet was descending rapidly. It was coming in far too steep. It was entirely silent. Commercial jets did not glide like that. The engines were dead. The fly-by-wire computers were burned out. He watched the massive metal tube slip below the distant green tree line. 3 seconds later, a muted thud vibrated through the thick rubber soles of his work boots. A thick plume of black smoke began to rise above the pines. There were no sirens. There was no radio chatter from emergency services. There was just the crackle of the dry grass burning near the substation security fence. Panic is a luxury a dead world cannot afford. Vance turned and sprinted toward the employee parking lot. His heavy boots crunched hard and fast on the gravel. His chest heaved. He had to get to Corinne and Silas. 200 miles separated them. 200 miles of dead cities, stalled highways, and terrified people who did not yet realize they had been thrown violently back to the Stone Age. He reached his vehicle. While the younger grid technicians drove electric cars and modern hybrids, Vance drove a 1986 Ford F-250. It had a mechanical diesel engine. It possessed 0 computer chips. There was no electronic fuel injection. It was just heavy iron, diesel fuel, and raw compression. He slid the metal key into the ignition. He prayed the starter motor had survived the massive induction wave. He turned the key. The starter clicked. It struggled for a fraction of a second. Then the heavy engine roared to life. A thick cloud of black exhaust puffed from the tailpipe. Vance let out a long breath he did not realize he was holding. He shifted the heavy transmission into park and reached behind the bench seat. He dragged his bug-out bag into the passenger seat. It was a heavy canvas tactical rucksack. Inside were water filtration straws, heavy-duty trauma, first aid gear, freeze-dried meals, and spare clothing. He unzipped the side pocket. He pulled out his Glock 19. He racked the slide back, a brass 9mm cartridge chambered with a satisfying, cold metallic click. He engaged the safety. He placed the pistol on the passenger seat right next to the bag. He shifted the truck into drive, slammed his boot on the accelerator, and tore out of the parking lot. The two-lane state highway leading to the interstate was a graveyard of modern engineering. Cars from the last 2 decades sat motionless on the hot asphalt. People were standing on the shoulder. They were staring at their dead phones, utterly confused. Some had popped their hoods, staring blankly at complex engines they did not understand. A woman in a red sedan waved her arms frantically as Vance approached. Vance gripped the leather steering wheel. His knuckles turned pure white. He did not touch the brakes. He steered the heavy Ford onto the grass shoulder, his large tires kicking up dry dirt and dead leaves as he bypassed her vehicle. He saw her face twist from confusion to anger in his rearview mirror. He hated leaving her there, but he had a wife and a teenage son waiting for him in a suburb that was about to tear itself apart. Charity was dead. Survival was the only metric that mattered now. He kept his foot hard on the gas. He needed to make the interstate. Interstate 95 was the only straight shot north. He knew the tactical risks. The highway would be a massive choke point, but he had to cover as much ground as possible before the masses realized help was never coming. The air conditioning in the truck was dead. The compressor clutch was fried. Hot summer air blew violently through the open windows. It carried the smell of ozone, burnt rubber, and the faint, sickening scent of distant fires. The grim reality of the situation settled heavily over his shoulders. Society was a fragile shell. It was entirely held together by invisible electrons moving through miles of copper wire. Without those electrons, the rules evaporated. The grocery stores would be empty in 3 days. The municipal water taps would run dry by tomorrow morning. An hour into the drive, his luck ran out. The interstate bridge up ahead crossed a wide, muddy river. The lanes were entirely blocked. Massive 18-wheeler tractor trailers had jackknifed when their electronic braking systems locked up at 60 miles per hour. Hundreds of cars, light trucks, and family vans were wedged together in a twisted, grinding maze of metal. Vance slammed his foot on the heavy brake pedal. The heavy Ford skidded, tires screaming against the hot asphalt. He came to a halt 100 yards from the massive logjam. He put the truck in park, but left the diesel engine idling. The rhythmic clatter of the mechanical engine was the only machine sound left in the entire world. He grabbed his binoculars from the dusty dashboard. He scanned the bridge. The heat radiating from the asphalt warped the air, making the scene look like a blurry mirage. People were pouring out of their cars. They were shouting. They were shoving each other. The thin civil veneer was already peeling away. It had only been 90 minutes since the flash. The midsummer heat was brutal, climbing toward 95 degrees. Hydration was already becoming a critical problem for the unprepared masses stuck on the concrete in the direct sun. Through the magnified lenses, Vance watched a man wearing a torn business suit approach a silver family minivan. The man was gesturing wildly. He kept pointing at his own dry mouth. The driver of the minivan shook his head rapidly and rolled up the window. The man in the suit did not walk away. He turned, walked over to a stalled pickup truck, and grabbed a heavy steel tire iron from the open bed. He marched right back to the minivan. He swung the iron bar violently. The safety glass shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Screams erupted from inside the van. A woman tried to push the man away. The attacker ignored her entirely. He reached in, unlocked the door from the inside, and dragged a heavy plastic case of bottled water out onto the hot asphalt. Other people saw this happen. The desperate energy was highly contagious. It spread through the stranded crowd like a rapid virus. 2 more men jogged over. They did not intervene to help the family. They attacked the man in the suit to grab the water for themselves. A brutal fistfight broke out right there on the highway over cheap plastic bottles. Fists hit bone. Blood sprayed onto the white paint of the minivan. Vance lowered the binoculars. His jaw tightened. He swallowed hard. The safe, predictable world he knew this morning was gone forever. He looked up into his rearview mirror. A group of 5 men was walking up the grassy median. They were heading directly toward his idling truck. They looked extremely thirsty. They looked angry. One of them was holding a jagged piece of broken concrete. Another had a wooden baseball bat resting on his right shoulder. They heard the deep rumble of his diesel engine. They knew he had power. They knew he had a working vehicle. They wanted it. Vance looked down at the black Glock resting on the passenger seat. He picked up the pistol. His thumb flicked the safety off. He pulled the door handle, stepped out of the truck, and planted his heavy boots on the hot asphalt. Chapter 2. The Suburban Trap. Corinne Harrison stood near the front of the high school chemistry lab. She held a clear glass beaker over a blue gas flame. 24 bored teenagers stared at her. The clock on the white-painted wall ticked loudly. It was 2:14 in the afternoon. The air conditioning rattled loudly in the ceiling vent. The room smelled faintly of sulfur and floor wax. Then the world stopped. The smartboard behind her went completely black. The blue gas flame sputtered and died as the electronic safety valve slammed shut. The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered wildly. They popped with a sharp crack. A shower of tiny white sparks rained down onto the linoleum floor. Corinne dropped the glass beaker. It shattered near her sensible brown shoes. Clear liquid splashed onto her bare ankles. The silence that followed was suffocating. The constant low mechanical hum of the building vanished entirely. The hallway vending machine stopped buzzing. The water fountain compressor went quiet. A girl sitting in the front row tapped her phone screen violently. She complained loudly that she had zero cell signal. Corinne ignored her. She walked fast toward the large windows. The sky outside the glass was fundamentally wrong. The bright summer blue was gone. The sky was fractured into jagged ribbons of neon green and deep bruised purple. It looked like an aurora borealis burning right through the afternoon sun. A deep vibration rattled the glass panes against their aluminum frames. Corinne did not wait for the principal to speak over the public address system. The public address system was dead anyway. Corinne taught advanced chemistry. She understood the raw physics of electromagnetic energy. She knew exactly what a colored sky in the middle of July meant. Vance had explained this nightmare scenario to her 100 times over dinner. She turned to face the confused students. Her voice was flat and extremely calm. She told them to pack their bags and go to the main gymnasium immediately. They groaned. They shoved thick textbooks into backpacks slowly. They did not understand the gravity of the silent room. Corinne did not have the time to explain solar flares or dead power grids. She grabbed her heavy leather purse from her desk. She walked straight out the heavy wooden door. She had to find her son. The hallways were a chaotic mess. Teenagers wandered aimlessly. They held up dead glass rectangles searching for service. Teachers stood in their doorways looking completely lost. She found Silas in the school library. He was 16 years old. He sat at a wooden table in the back corner. He was staring blankly at a black tablet screen. He looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. She grabbed his arm. Her grip was tight. She pulled him up out of his wooden chair. She told him they were leaving the building right now. Silas asked about his history exam. Corinne pulled him toward the exit. She told him school was over forever. They pushed open the heavy double glass doors. The sticky July heat hit them like a physical wall. The large student parking lot was filled with motionless vehicles. A few older boys were turning ignition keys in their cars. Starter motors cranked hard, but the engines completely refused to catch. The delicate engine control modules were permanently fried. Corinne and Silas lived exactly 2 miles from the high school campus. They walked fast along the concrete sidewalks. The residential streets were full of confused people. Neighbors stood out on their green front lawns. They pointed fingers at the strange glowing sky. A delivery driver in a brown uniform was slamming his heavy fists against the steering wheel of his box truck. He screamed that his battery was suddenly dead. Corinne kept her head down. She gripped Silas tightly by his thin wrist. She dragged him forward. The humidity was oppressive. Sweat soaked through her cotton blouse. Her flat shoes slapped hard against the hot concrete. Silas breathed heavily. He asked her what was happening. He asked why the cell towers were not working. Corinne looked straight ahead. She told him it was a massive solar event. She told him every piece of modern electronics was destroyed. Silas stopped walking. He looked down at his dead phone. His voice shook. He asked her if the internet would come back online tomorrow morning. Corinne pulled him hard by the arm. She forced him to keep walking. She told him no. She told him the internet was gone. They turned the corner onto Elm Street. The distant sound of emergency sirens was completely missing. That was the most terrifying realization for Corinne. In any normal disaster, the air would be thick with police sirens and fire engine horns. Now there was only the sound of barking dogs and scared people yelling. Their 2-story colonial house looked exactly normal from the street, but the digital security keypad next to the front door was dark. Corinne dug into her purse. She found her brass key. She unlocked the heavy deadbolt. They stepped into the dark foyer. The house was already stifling hot without the central air conditioning pumping. She pulled the door shut behind them. She locked the deadbolt. She slid the brass chain into the metal track. A heavy fist pounded on the outside of the oak door. Corinne jumped back. Silas retreated into the dark hallway. Corinne leaned forward. She pressed her eye against the small glass peephole. It was Greg from the house across the street. He looked completely panicked. His face was bright red. Sweat poured down his forehead. He knocked again. He yelled her name through the thick wood. He said his wife was on an oxygen concentrator. He said the medical machine stopped working and his expensive backup gas generator would not start. He begged Corinne for help. Corinne rested her forehead against the warm wood of the door. Her stomach churned violently. Bitter acid rose in the back of her throat. She was a teacher. She spent her entire adult life helping young people. But her husband Vance had warned her about this exact moment. Vance was a pragmatic man. He understood the brutal math of survival. If she opened that door, she would have to share their limited medical supplies. Greg would talk. The entire street would quickly learn the Harrisons had a basement full of emergency food and clean water. Her family would be overrun and starved out in less than 3 days. She stepped back from the door. She clamped her right hand over her own mouth to muffle her breathing. Silas whispered from the dark hallway. He asked why she was not opening the door for their neighbor. Corinne looked at her teenage son. Her eyes grew cold and hard. She told Silas to stay absolutely quiet. Greg pounded his bloody fists against the heavy wood. He cursed loudly. He called her terrible names. He kicked the bottom of the door. Finally, his heavy footsteps faded away down the wooden porch stairs. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. She had just drawn a line in the sand. Modern civilization ended at her front porch. Inside these walls, there was only survival. Silas began to shake. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he stared at his useless phone. He kept swiping his thumb across the dead glass screen. He was breathing much too fast. A severe panic attack was building in his chest. Corinne walked into the dark kitchen. She opened the pantry door. She ignored the refrigerator. The milk and meat inside would spoil and rot in 2 days. She walked back to Silas. She slapped the expensive phone right out of his hand. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Silas looked up at her in total shock. His mouth fell open. Corinne grabbed him by both shoulders. Her fingernails dug into his skin. She looked directly into his panicked eyes. She told him the digital world was dead. She told him he had to live in the physical world starting right now. She needed to give him a physical job. He needed to focus his mind on a tangible task to stop the panic. She told him to go down the wooden stairs to the basement. She told him to count the heavy blue 5-gallon water jugs. She told him to find the ceramic water filtration pumps. Then she told him to open the heavy steel gun safe in the corner. Silas swallowed hard. He asked if they really needed to get the guns out. Corinne nodded slowly. She told him to bring up the black 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. She told him to grab the green canvas bandolier full of double-aught buckshot. She told him to bring up the compound hunting bow and the heavy steel broadheads. Silas nodded. The raw panic in his eyes was slowly replaced by a grim realization. He turned around and walked down the dark basement stairs. Corinne went to the kitchen utility drawers. She pulled out 3 heavy rolls of silver duct tape and a box of thick black plastic contractor bags. Since the regional power was out, the municipal water treatment plants were fully offline. That meant the toilets would stop flushing very soon. She had to secure their sanitation immediately. She also had to tape thick blankets over all the downstairs windows to hide their flashlights tonight. She worked in total silence. She thought about Vance. He was 200 miles away at the switching station. She pictured him driving his old truck. She hoped his mechanical diesel engine had survived the magnetic pulse. She needed him here. She was strong, but she knew she could not fight off a starving neighborhood alone. 2 hours passed. The sun began to dip below the tall oak trees. Long, dark shadows stretched across the manicured green lawns of Elm Street. The extreme heat broke slightly, but the violent tension in the air only grew much thicker. Corinne stood in the center of the dark living room. She held the heavy black steel shotgun. The slide action was locked fully forward. 5 red plastic shells were loaded into the metal tubular magazine. The rough texture of the synthetic grip dug into her sweaty palms. She kept her finger resting flat above the trigger guard. She stepped carefully toward the front window. She pulled back a tiny sliver of the drawn vinyl blinds. She peered out into the fading light. The street was no longer filled with confused neighbors asking questions. The regular people had retreated into their dark homes out of fear. A group of 4 strange men walked straight down the middle of the asphalt. They did not look confused. They looked extremely purposeful. They wore bright Orange County jail jumpsuits. The top halves were unbuttoned and tied tightly around their waists. They wore dirty white ribbed undershirts. The local county detention center was only 3 miles down the road. The electronic security doors must have failed into an open position when the backup generators fried. One of the muscular men carried a heavy rusted steel crowbar. Another held a large bloody kitchen knife with a black plastic handle. They stopped directly in front of a brick house at the corner of the block. The tall man with the crowbar walked confidently up the concrete driveway. He swung the heavy iron bar. He completely shattered the large bay window. He reached his tattooed arm inside through the broken glass and unlocked the front door. The 4 violent men stepped casually inside the dark house. 10 seconds later, a woman screamed from inside the living room. The terrified scream was abruptly cut short by a sickening thud. Corinne felt the blood drain entirely from her face. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. The men walked back out the front door. One of them wiped the large knife on his orange pants. They dragged a heavy white plastic cooler full of food out onto the green lawn. The leader with the bloody blade looked down the dark street. He raised his arm. He pointed the tip of his knife directly at the front door of the Harrison house. The 4 men stepped off the grass and started walking down the asphalt straight toward Corinne. Chapter 3. Blood on the asphalt. Vance Harrison looked at the dashboard. The fuel gauge needle rested entirely below the red line. The heavy mechanical diesel engine sputtered loudly. It choked on fumes. Then it died. The sudden silence inside the truck cabin was heavy. Vance looked through the dusty windshield. The interstate was completely choked with dead vehicles. Metal was twisted into a massive barricade of rusted steel and shattered glass. There was no way forward on wheels. The remaining distance to his family was 180 miles. He had to do it on foot. He grabbed his heavy canvas bug-out bag from the passenger seat. He slung the thick padded straps over his shoulders. He checked the magazine of his Glock 19. 15 rounds of 9mm hollow points. He slapped the magazine back into the black polymer grip. He racked the slide. He chambered around. He engaged the safety. He tucked the pistol into the rigid plastic holster on his right hip. He opened the heavy truck door. The brutal July heat hit him instantly. It smelled of melting asphalt and distant wood smoke. People were screaming further down the highway. The mob he had escaped earlier was busy tearing a delivery van apart for food. Vance did not look back. He stepped over the metal guardrail. He slid down the steep embankment. He disappeared into the thick green tree line. The woods were dense. Tall pine trees blocked out the harsh afternoon sun. The air under the canopy was thick and humid. Sweat poured down his face. It stung his eyes. Pine needles crunched softly beneath his heavy leather work boots. He moved parallel to the highway. He needed to keep moving north. 2 hours passed. His thigh muscles burned. The heavy canvas bag dug painfully into his shoulders. He stopped next to a massive oak tree to drink from his plastic canteen. The lukewarm water coated his dry throat. A twig snapped loudly to his left. Vance dropped the canteen. His right hand instantly dropped to the plastic holster. 3 men stepped out from behind a thick cluster of green bushes. They did not look like confused stranded drivers. They looked like scavengers. The tallest man wore a stained white tank top. He held a heavy rusted tire iron. The second man had a crude wooden club wrapped in barbed wire. The third man held a rusted machete. The tall man stepped forward. He smiled. His teeth were yellow and broken. He told Vance to drop the heavy bag. Vance kept his hand hovering over the black pistol grip. He told the men to walk away. He said his voice was calm, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The man with the machete lunged forward. He moved incredibly fast. Vance drew his Glock. He did not have time to aim down the iron sights. He fired from the hip. The loud gunshot echoed violently through the silent woods. The brass casing flew through the air. The bullet missed. It shattered the bark of a pine tree right behind the attacker. The man with the tire iron swung hard. The heavy metal slammed into Vance. It hit his left shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm. Vance lost his grip on the pistol. The black gun spun away and landed in the thick green ferns. Vance fell hard into the dirt. The heavy bag pinned him down. The man with the machete raised the rusted blade high into the air. Vance threw his right arm up to block the strike. He knew it would not be enough. He braced for the deep cut. A loud crack split the humid air. It was not a pistol shot. It sounded like a high-powered rifle. The man with the machete jerked violently. A red mist sprayed from his chest. His eyes rolled back into his head. He collapsed instantly into the dirt. The tall man with the tire iron froze. He looked down at his dead friend. Another loud crack echoed through the trees. The tall man dropped the heavy iron bar. He grabbed his shoulder. Blood poured between his fingers. He turned and sprinted blindly into the deep brush. The third man with the wooden club was already gone. He ran away the second the first shot rang out. Vance lay on the ground. He breathed heavily. The metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the pine needles. Footsteps crunched slowly on the dry leaves. A man stepped out from the shadows of the tall pines. He was in his mid-50s. He had a thick gray beard. His face was weathered and deeply lined from years in the sun. He wore faded olive-green tactical pants and a drab brown canvas jacket. He held a bolt-action rifle chambered in .308. A black metal suppressor was attached to the end of the long barrel. The older man kept the rifle aimed casually at the ground. He walked over to Vance. He kicked the bloody machete away from the dead body. The man looked down at Vance. He asked if Vance was going to bleed to death on his boots. Vance grunted. He rolled over. He pushed himself up with his good right arm. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, burning ache. He said his shoulder was bruised, but not broken. The older man nodded. He slung the long rifle over his shoulder. He introduced himself as Nash Caldwell. Nash immediately bent over. He grabbed his chest. A violent coughing fit shook his entire body. It was a deep, rattling cough. It sounded like fluid filling his lungs. Nash pulled a dirty white handkerchief from his pocket. He wiped his mouth. He looked pale. Vance stood up. He brushed the dirt off his jeans. He walked over to the green ferns. He picked up his 9mm pistol. He wiped the dirt off the slide and holstered it. He looked at Nash. He recognized the pale skin and the ragged breathing. It was a severe respiratory infection. In the old world, it required a simple doctor visit. In this new dead world, it was a death sentence. Nash leaned against a tree. He caught his breath. He said the woods were full of hungry, desperate people. He said Vance was making too much noise. He said Vance would not survive another 10 miles alone. Vance looked at the dead man bleeding into the dirt. He knew Nash was right. He needed a guide. He needed someone who knew the backwoods trails to avoid the choked highways. But trust was expensive today. Vance proposed a trade. He spoke clearly. He told Nash he was a regional grid engineer. He told Nash his job required him to inspect the backup power systems for every major commercial facility in the county. He told Nash he knew the exact physical address of the primary pharmaceutical distribution warehouse for the entire state. It was a massive concrete bunker hidden in an industrial park 20 miles north. Nash stopped wiping his mouth. He stared at Vance. His gray eyes were sharp and calculating. Vance pointed at the bloody handkerchief. He said Nash needed strong antibiotics right now. He said the pharmacies in the towns would be completely looted by tomorrow morning. He said the main warehouse would still have pallets of amoxicillin and strong painkillers sitting in the dark. Vance offered the location. He offered to help Nash bypass the heavy steel security doors. In exchange, Nash would guide him safely through the woods and escort him past the hostile town borders. Nash considered the offer. He looked at the thick trees. He looked back at Vance. He spat on the ground. He agreed. They did not shake hands. There was no time for formalities. Nash turned and started walking north through the dense brush. Vance adjusted the heavy straps of his canvas bag. He followed close behind. They walked in complete silence for 3 hours. The sun dropped lower. The shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor. They reached the edge of the tree line just as dusk settled. Nash held up his fist. He crouched low behind a thick fallen log. Vance dropped down beside him. They were looking down at a small valley. A paved county road ran straight through a small rural town. The town was no longer a quiet community. It was a fortress. Heavy farm tractors and overturned pickup trucks blocked the main road. The vehicles formed a massive steel wall. Tall wooden guard towers were hastily built on top of the truck cabs. Men stood on the barricades. They were wearing matching black armbands over their civilian clothes. They carried black .556 caliber carbine rifles. These were not confused neighbors. These were highly organized armed guards. Vance pulled his binoculars from his bag. He focused the lenses on the main gate. A large white banner was hung across the front of an overturned school bus. The words painted in red spray paint read "Cold Territory." Vance shifted the binoculars down to the dirt road in front of the barricade. A group of local civilians was kneeling in the dust. There were 2 men and 1 older woman. Their hands were tied tightly behind their backs with thick plastic zip ties. A man in a clean white button-down shirt walked out from behind the barricade. He did not carry a rifle. He looked calm. He looked entirely out of place. He spoke to the kneeling people. Vance could not hear the words over the distance. The man in the white shirt shook his head slowly. He gestured with his hand to the guards standing on the trucks. 3 guards raised their black rifles. They aimed down at the kneeling civilians. The loud crack of gunfire echoed through the quiet valley. The 3 civilians collapsed face first into the dust. The man in the white shirt turned around and casually walked back behind the steel barricades. Vance lowered the binoculars. His throat went completely dry. Nash looked over at Vance. The older man racked the bolt of his suppressed rifle. He whispered that the only way to the medical warehouse was straight through that town. Vance felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. The path home had just become a war zone. Chapter 4. The Predator's Logic. Judson Cole stood in the exact center of the suburban intersection. He wore a clean blue button-down shirt. His khaki pants were perfectly pressed. His brown leather shoes were shined. He did not look like a violent warlord taking over a neighborhood. He looked exactly like what he was yesterday morning. He was a senior regional logistics manager for a massive national retail supply chain. Cole did not view the shattered sky and the dead electrical grid as a tragedy. He viewed it as a hostile corporate takeover. He understood inventory better than anyone in the county. He understood the brutal math of supply and demand. Right now, the demand for food and clean water was infinite. The supply was permanently fixed. Every grocery store had been stripped bare by the panicked masses within the first 10 hours. He held a red and white plastic bullhorn in his right hand. He pressed the black trigger. The battery-powered amplifier crackled to life. The sharp electronic static echoed down the quiet tree-lined street. He told the hiding people of Elm Street to listen carefully. He did not yell. He did not threaten them with a raised voice. His tone was professional and terrifyingly calm. He announced that his organization had secured the perimeter of their neighborhood. He told them that violent mobs from the burning city center were moving into the suburbs right now. He said his men were the only thing standing between their families and absolute slaughter. He laid out the terms of his protection contract. The math was simple. Every household must leave 80% of their canned goods, bottled water, and medical supplies on their front lawn by sunset. If they complied, his men would patrol the streets and keep them safe. If they resisted, they would be left to fend for themselves against the starving hordes. Cole lowered the heavy plastic bullhorn. He looked at the dozen men standing behind him. They were a mixed crew. Some were warehouse forklift drivers who followed his orders out of habit. Others were local toughs and opportunistic criminals he had recruited from a stalled prison transport bus on the highway. They held heavy steel pipes, wooden baseball bats, and a few stolen bolt-action hunting rifles. Cole knew the 80% rule was a slow death sentence for these suburban families. They would starve in a matter of weeks, but he needed the calories to feed his growing army of enforcers. Empathy was an inefficient metric. Human lives were now just line items on a spreadsheet. He was building a new empire based on canned beans, clean water, and absolute control. Silas Harrison knelt behind the heavy fabric sofa in his living room. His bare knees ached against the hardwood floor. He held his father's black 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. His hands were incredibly slick with nervous sweat. He wiped his right palm violently on his denim jeans. He gripped the textured plastic of the weapon again. He looked through a narrow 2-inch gap in the drawn vinyl window blinds. He saw the man with the red bullhorn standing at the end of the block. He heard the terrible ultimatum clearly through the single pane glass. 80% of their food. Silas turned his head slowly. He looked back toward the dark kitchen. His mother was not panicking. Corinne was completely focused. The granite kitchen island looked like a makeshift laboratory. She had gathered every harsh chemical she could find in the garage and under the sink. Crushed pool, chlorinating tablets sat in a plastic bowl. A plastic jug of automotive brake fluid rested next to ripped sheets of aluminum foil. She had lined up several heavy glass mason jars on the counter. Corinne told Silas to keep his eyes on the street. She spoke in short, direct sentences. Her voice was steady and cold. She poured a measure of white chemical powder into a glass jar. She told her son that the men outside were not police officers or soldiers. She said they were predators looking for easy prey. She carried 3 finished glass jars to the front door. She set them down carefully on the wooden floorboards. She explained the crude chemistry. She had mixed calcium hypochlorite with polyethylene glycol. She told Silas that if she threw the jars hard enough to shatter the glass, the chemicals would mix instantly. The resulting exothermic reaction would create a flash of heat and a massive cloud of toxic white gas. It was a homemade smoke bomb. It would temporarily blind and choke anyone trying to rush through the front door. Silas swallowed the dry lump in his throat. His mouth tasted like old copper. He asked his mother if they should just put a few boxes of food on the lawn. He asked if maybe the men would just take the offering and go away. Corinne stopped moving. She stood up straight. She looked directly into the eyes of her teenage son. Her green eyes were perfectly hard. She told him predators never stop at just a little bit of food. She explained the terrible logic of the new world. If those men saw the heavy blue water jugs or the expensive boxes of freeze-dried camping meals, they would know the house was a gold mine. They would take all the supplies. They would take the house. They would take their lives. Out on the asphalt, Judson Cole walked slowly up the center line of Elm Street. Two heavily armed men walked slightly ahead of him. The hot summer sun was dipping lower behind the two-story houses. The oppressive heat of the afternoon was finally breaking. Most of the manicured front lawns were entirely empty. The normal people were too terrified to come outside, but a few desperate families had actually complied with the demand. A man 3 houses down dragged a heavy cardboard box full of dry pasta and canned soup onto his concrete driveway. The man kept his head down. He scurried back inside his house and locked his heavy front door. Cole smiled thinly. He nodded to his men. 2 of them jogged over and picked up the heavy box of calories. Then Cole stopped walking. He looked at the large colonial house in the middle of the block, the Harrison house. The windows were entirely covered from the inside with thick black plastic contractor bags and silver duct tape. There was no food on the lawn. There was no sign of weakness or compliance. Cole pointed his index finger at the house. He told his 2-point men to go knock on that specific door. He told his crew that a house sealed up that tight was hiding a massive stockpile of supplies. He decided he wanted the inventory inside. The 2-point men jogged across the manicured green lawn. One of them carried a heavy wooden bat with long, rusted nails driven through the thick end. The other man held a stolen police-issue shotgun. Silas watched the 2 men through the narrow slit in the blinds. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. It sounded like a fast drum playing inside his ears. The men were walking straight toward his front porch. They were not slowing down. Corinne grabbed Silas by the shoulder. She pulled him away from the window. She pushed him toward the front hallway. She told him to rack the shotgun right now. Silas gripped the ridged plastic forend of the heavy weapon. He pulled it back hard and slammed it forward with all his strength. The metal action chunked loudly in the quiet house. A red plastic shell full of heavy lead buckshot was now sitting in the firing chamber. The man with the nailed bat stepped heavily onto the wooden front porch. He raised his heavy leather boot to kick the front door. Corinne yelled for Silas to aim low. Silas did not hesitate. He did not freeze. He did not think about his high school friends or his dead video games. He thought about the men in the orange jumpsuits from yesterday. He aimed the heavy black barrel at the lower half of the thick wooden door. He pulled the curved metal trigger. The recoil was incredibly violent. The heavy synthetic stock slammed hard into his right shoulder bone. A deafening roar filled the small living room. A massive jagged hole exploded outward through the bottom of the solid oak door. Splinters of sharp wood flew across the porch. The deafening blast echoed all the way down Elm Street. The man with the nailed bat screamed in absolute agony. He fell backward off the porch and landed hard in the dirt bushes. He clutched his bleeding leg. The heavy lead pellets had shredded right through the thick wood and caught him directly above his left knee. The second man dropped his stolen weapon. He ran away in pure panic. He dragged his screaming friend across the green grass, leaving a dark trail of blood. Judson Cole stood completely still in the middle of the street. He watched his 2 men retreat in failure. He did not look angry. He looked entirely fascinated. He analyzed the tactical situation instantly. A shotgun blast from inside meant the occupants had weapons and the will to use them. The heavy black window coverings meant they were actively preparing for a long siege. A prepared family meant they possessed a significant inventory of high-value assets: water filters, medical trauma gear, ammunition, thousands of calories. Cole turned around to face his growing mob of armed men. He told them to leave the rest of the neighborhood alone for tonight. He pointed his finger directly at the Harrison house. He raised his voice slightly. He told his starving crew that the people inside that specific house were hoarding the exact supplies that would keep them all alive. He expertly manufactured their anger. He weaponized their fear of starvation. He ordered his men to surround the entire property line. He said nobody gets out alive. Inside the dark hallway, Silas dropped the heavy barrel of the shotgun toward the floor. His ears rang loudly with a high-pitched metallic whine. The sharp smell of burnt sulfur and smokeless powder completely filled the stagnant air. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, dull ache. Corinne put her hand firmly on his back. Her fingers were shaking slightly, but her voice remained perfectly steady. She told him he did exactly what he had to do. She told him to load another red shell into the metal tube immediately. Silas reached into his front pockets. His fingers fumbled with the smooth plastic of the spare ammunition. He shoved 2 more heavy rounds into the metal loading gate at the bottom of the receiver. The heavy weapon felt like a physical anchor in his tired hands. The sun finally dropped below the distant tree line. The last remaining streaks of purple light faded into absolute blackness. Without the ambient glow of the city streetlights, the darkness was incredibly thick. It was a complete sensory void. The summer crickets chirped loudly in the tall grass outside for a few minutes. Then they suddenly went completely silent. Corinne picked up her glass jars of chemical fire. She moved slowly toward the back of the house. Silas heard the first sound a moment later. It came from the kitchen area. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of boots stepping on the dry, dead leaves in their fenced backyard. Then came the harsh metallic screech of a steel crowbar prying violently against the aluminum frame of the sliding glass patio door. The wood framing groaned under the extreme physical pressure. The heavy glass cracked loudly in the dark. The breach had begun. Chapter 5. The Convergence. Vance Harrison lay flat on his stomach in the tall, dry grass. The dirt smelled like old copper and dead pine needles. 50 yards ahead, the barricade blocked the main county road. 2 men stood on top of an overturned yellow school bus. They held black 5.56 carbine rifles. A heavy diesel farm tractor was parked sideways to block the remaining gap in the asphalt. The tractor had a large front-loader bucket. It was exactly what Vance needed. Nash lay 2 feet away. He adjusted the optic on his suppressed .308 bolt-action rifle. He coughed softly into his dirty sleeve. He wiped his mouth. He looked at Vance. He said he would take the guard on the left. He told Vance to take the guard on the right. Vance drew his Glock 19 from the plastic holster. His palms were slick with cold sweat. He wiped his right hand on his denim jeans. He gripped the black polymer handle tightly. He checked the chamber. 1 round ready. 14 in the magazine. He breathed in slowly. The air was thick and humid. Nash exhaled. The suppressed rifle fired. A sharp metallic click and a soft hiss cut through the heavy air. The guard on the left side of the bus dropped instantly. He fell backward off the yellow metal roof. His body hit the asphalt with a dull thud. The guard on the right turned his head in confusion. He raised his rifle. He did not know where the shot came from. Vance stood up from the grass. He raised his pistol. He aligned the white dot of the front sight with the center of the man. His hands shook slightly. He pulled the trigger. The loud crack of the 9mm echoed off the tall trees. The shot missed. It hit the yellow metal of the bus. The guard turned toward Vance. He pointed his black carbine directly at him. Vance moved off the line of fire. He sprinted toward the cover of a rusted pickup truck near the barricade. Dirt kicked up around his boots as the guard fired a burst. The sharp crack of supersonic rounds snapped past his ears. Concrete dust showered over his shoulders. Vance crouched behind the rusted steel wheel. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. His stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. He had never been in a gunfight. He built power grids. He fixed transformers. Now he was trading bullets in a country ditch. He heard heavy boots hitting the asphalt. The guard was moving down from the bus. The man was flanking him. Vance peeked around the rusty fender. The guard was only 10 feet away. The man raised his carbine. Vance stepped out. He did not think. He let pure animal instinct take over. He thrust the pistol forward. He pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The first hollow point round struck the guard in the stomach. The second round hit his collarbone. The man collapsed forward. His rifle clattered across the rough pavement. He lay on his back. He coughed violently. Bright red blood bubbled over his lips. His hands gripped the front of his dark shirt. Vance walked over to him. The metallic smell of fresh blood filled his nose. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The bile rose in the back of his throat. He looked down at the dying man. He had just taken a human life. The weight of that action crushed down on his chest. It felt like a heavy stone sitting on his lungs. Then he thought of Silas. He thought of Corinne. They were trapped inside a dark house surrounded by predators just like this man. The cold knot in his stomach hardened into pure steel. The guilt vanished. It was replaced by a brutal necessity. The old rules of civilization were dead. Vance was a father. He would burn the entire world to the ground to protect his family. Nash jogged out from the tree line. He kept his rifle raised. He checked the perimeter. He nodded at the green John Deere tractor parked across the road. He said they needed to move right now. Vance holstered his pistol. He climbed up the large black tire of the heavy tractor. He slid into the worn leather seat. The keys were dangling in the ignition. The men guarding the barricade had left it ready to move in case they needed to open the gate. Vance turned the metal key. The heavy mechanical diesel engine roared to life. A thick plume of black exhaust blew out of the vertical chrome pipe. The loud clatter of the pistons was deafening. It had no computer chips. The pulse had not destroyed it. Nash climbed up the metal steps. He stood on the platform right behind the seat. He held onto the yellow roll bar with one hand. He aimed his rifle backward with his other hand. He told Vance to drive. Vance grabbed the heavy hydraulic lever. He lifted the massive steel front bucket. He shifted the transmission into high gear. He slammed his boot down on the metal accelerator pedal. The huge green machine lurched forward. Its massive rear tires bit hard into the asphalt. They drove straight through the wooden debris of the barricade. Splinters of wood and twisted metal scraped loudly against the steel bucket. Loud shouts erupted from the buildings down the street. Several armed men ran out of a brick storefront. They raised their weapons. Muzzle flashes flickered in the fading light. Bullets pinged against the thick iron engine block of the tractor. One round shattered the glass mirror next to Vance. Vance ducked his head. He kept his foot pinned to the floor. The tractor was slow. It topped out at maybe 20 miles per hour, but it was practically a tank. The heavy iron absorbed the small arms fire easily. They rumbled past the town limits and turned onto the open county highway heading south toward the suburbs. The sun was completely gone now. The sky was an empty black void. Without streetlights or house lights, the darkness was absolute. The only illumination came from the dull yellow glow of the tractor headlights slicing through the humid night air. Vance drove in silence. The heavy vibration of the diesel engine numbed his hands. The landscape rolling past them was a nightmare. It was a vision of hell on earth. They passed massive housing subdivisions. The homes were completely dark. Cars were crashed into trees and telephone poles. Thick columns of black smoke rose into the night sky from the distant city center. The fires glowed with a dull, angry orange light on the horizon. There were no fire engines to stop the burning. The city would simply burn until there was nothing left but ash. Bodies lay scattered along the grassy shoulders of the road. Some were victims of car crashes from when the digital brakes failed. Others were victims of the violence that exploded immediately after the power died. Vance saw a minivan on its side. A man lay motionless in the ditch beside it. A spilled box of cheap cereal was scattered across the bloody concrete. Humanity had stripped away thousands of years of evolution in less than 48 hours. Without the grid, people were starving animals. Nash coughed violently behind him. The sick man leaned heavily against the yellow roll bar. His breathing sounded like wet gravel. He tapped Vance on the shoulder. He pointed a dirty finger toward a green highway sign illuminated by their headlights. The sign read Elm Street 2 miles. They were incredibly close. Vance gripped the steering wheel tighter. His knuckles turned white. His left shoulder still throbbed with deep pain from the tire iron attack earlier that day. He ignored it. He focused entirely on the road ahead. He slowed the heavy machine as they approached the intersection of his neighborhood. The streets here were choked with dead modern cars. Vance used the large steel bucket on the front of the tractor to push a silver sedan out of the way. The metal scraped horribly against the asphalt. He did not care about the noise anymore. Stealth was impossible with a heavy diesel engine. Speed and brute force were his only remaining options. They turned onto Elm Street. The neighborhood was dead silent over the roar of the tractor. The manicured lawns were swallowed by the thick darkness. Vance squinted through the dirty windshield. He looked down the block toward his house. The property was a large 2-story colonial, sitting perfectly in the middle of the street. He saw movement in the dark. Dozens of men were swarming across his green lawn. They carried heavy flashlights and wooden clubs. Some held long metal crowbars. They were tearing at the wooden fence in the backyard. They were kicking at the heavy front door. It looked like a colony of angry fire ants attacking a single mound. Judson Cole and his men had already arrived. Vance slammed his foot on the brake pedal. The tractor stopped 50 yards away from the house. He threw the transmission into park. The engine idled loudly. Nash raised his suppressed rifle to his shoulder. He looked through the optic. He said there were at least 20 men outside. He said they were breaching the back patio right now. Vance stood up from the driver's seat. He drew his Glock 19. He checked the magazine instinctively. He only had 11 rounds left. It was not enough, not even close. He looked up at the second story of his house. The window to his master bedroom was completely covered from the inside with thick black plastic. Suddenly, a violent flash of bright yellow light ripped through the dark plastic covering. The sharp, deafening roar of a 12-gauge shotgun echoed loudly across the silent neighborhood. Another flash illuminated the dark window, then a third. Someone inside was firing down onto the lawn. Vance felt a massive surge of adrenaline flood his veins. It was Silas. His son was fighting for his life. The predators were inside the wire. Vance jumped down from the heavy metal tractor. He hit the asphalt running. He charged straight into the darkness toward the flashes of gunfire. Chapter 6. Shattered Dawn. Corinne Harrison backed away from the splintering wood of the master bedroom door. The air inside the room was thick with toxic white smoke. Her lungs burned with every shallow breath. Her eyes watered constantly. She had thrown her last glass jar of homemade chemicals 3 minutes ago. The violent chemical reaction had choked the first wave of men on the stairs, but the smoke was clearing now. Heavy leather boots kicked violently against the hallway side of the door. The brass hinges groaned under the extreme physical stress. The wood cracked loudly. Silas stood right beside her in the dark. He held the heavy black shotgun. He pulled the plastic trigger. A dull metallic click echoed in the small room. The tubular magazine was completely empty. He had fired his last red shell into the ceiling to scare them back. It did not work. The starving men outside were past the point of fear. Silas dropped the useless shotgun onto the carpet. He reached down to his thick leather belt. He pulled out a fixed-blade hunting knife. His hands shook uncontrollably. He gripped the rubber handle tight. Corinne held a heavy steel tire iron she had taken from the garage. The cold metal was slick with sweat from her palms. She stepped in front of her son. She would not let them touch him. A heavy steel crowbar smashed through the center panel of the wooden door. Jagged splinters flew across the dark bedroom. A dirty hand reached through the hole. The hand fumbled for the brass deadbolt lock. Corinne raised the heavy iron bar. She swung it down with all her remaining strength. The steel struck flesh and bone. A sickening crunch echoed in the room. A man screamed in absolute agony from the dark hallway. The bloody hand quickly pulled back through the broken wood. But the victory was only temporary. A massive weight slammed into the weakened door. The wood frame completely shattered. 2 large men pushed their way into the bedroom. They held heavy flashlights and rusted pipes. They shined the blinding white beams directly into Corinne's face. She raised her arm to block the light. She tightened her grip on the steel bar. She prepared to die fighting. Then the entire house shook violently. Vance Harrison sprinted across the dark asphalt of Elm Street. His heavy work boots pounded against the ground. The sharp smell of chemical smoke and burnt gunpowder filled his nose. Behind him, the heavy green farm tractor roared like an angry beast. Nash Caldwell stood on the back platform. Nash steered the massive diesel machine right over the concrete curb. He drove it straight toward the side of the property. The heavy steel front bucket slammed into the tall wooden privacy fence. Wood splintered loudly. The fence completely collapsed. The loud destruction instantly drew the attention of the armed men standing on the front porch. They turned their flashlights toward the side yard in total confusion. Vance did not stop running. He bypassed the front porch entirely. He ran through the gap in the broken fence. He reached the back patio. The sliding glass door was completely shattered. Sharp glass crunched loudly under his boots as he stepped into his own dark kitchen. 2 men stood near the granite island. They were hastily shoving cans of soup and boxes of dry pasta into a dirty canvas bag. The sudden noise of glass breaking under Vance's boots made them turn around. One man reached for a hunting knife in his belt. Vance raised his Glock 19. He did not hesitate. He aimed center mass. He pulled the trigger twice. The deafening cracks of the 9mm pistol echoed off the tile walls. The hollow point bullet struck the man in the chest. He collapsed backward into the metal refrigerator. The second man dropped the canvas bag. He raised his hands in the air. He tried to speak. Vance fired 1 round into his stomach. The man folded in half and dropped to the linoleum floor. Mercy was a luxury of the old world. These men came to kill his family. Vance stepped over the bleeding bodies. He moved quickly into the dark living room. Thick white chemical smoke hung heavy in the stagnant air. Flashlight beams cut wildly through the haze. Men were shouting in panic. A suppressed rifle shot hissed from the front hallway. Nash had entered through the broken front door. A looter standing near the bottom of the wooden stairs dropped his wooden bat and fell face first onto the hardwood floor. Vance pushed his way to the base of the staircase. A large man wearing a dirty white tank top jumped down from the third step. He swung a heavy metal pipe directly at Vance's head. Vance ducked low. The heavy steel pipe smashed a massive hole in the drywall above him. Plaster dust rained down. Vance drove his left shoulder hard into the attacker's stomach. A sharp pain flared in his bruised shoulder joint. He ignored it. He shoved the pistol barrel directly against the man's ribs. He pulled the trigger. The muffled shot dropped the large man instantly. Vance stepped over the body and started climbing the wooden stairs. He stopped halfway up. A tall man stood on the top landing. It was Judson Cole. He wore a clean blue shirt. He looked entirely calm amid the absolute chaos. Cole held a heavy silver revolver in his right hand. Cole looked down the stairs at Vance. Then he looked toward the front door where Nash was methodically clearing the living room. Cole possessed a sharp, analytical mind. He instantly calculated the tactical shift. His crew was broken. He was losing men fast to superior firepower. Cole raised the heavy revolver. He pointed it down the stairs directly at Vance. He pulled the trigger. The loud boom of the large caliber weapon deafened Vance in the enclosed stairway. The bullet missed his head by an inch. It splintered the wooden banister. Wood chips cut into Vance's cheek. Vance dropped low against the stairs. He aimed his pistol upward. Cole did not fire a second shot. He took a calculated step backward into the dark shadows of the hallway. His calm voice echoed down the stairs. He said this neighborhood belonged to him. He said they would finish this conversation very soon. Vance fired 2 rounds into the dark hallway. The bullets hit empty drywall. He heard the heavy footsteps of Cole running down the back corridor. He heard the guest bedroom window slide open violently. The predator was retreating into the night. Vance rushed up the remaining stairs. He ignored Cole for now. He ran straight to the open doorway of the master bedroom. He aimed his pistol inside. A man lay groaning on the carpet with a crushed knee. Corinne stood over him. She held a bloody steel tire iron. Her chest heaved with heavy breaths. Silas stood close behind her. He held his hunting knife ready. Vance lowered his weapon. His hands began to shake again. He called her name softly. Corinne dropped the heavy steel bar. It hit the floor with a dull thud. She ran across the room. She crashed into his chest. Vance wrapped his arms around her tight. He buried his face in her dark hair. Silas stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. They stood together in the dark, smoke-filled room. Vance closed his eyes. His hands were covered in grease and dried blood. His clothes smelled like death and diesel fuel. But his family was breathing. They were alive. Dawn broke over Elm Street with a dull gray light. The summer heat began to rise immediately. The heavy black plastic bags covering the living room windows had been torn down. Vance stood in the center of his destroyed kitchen. Broken glass and dried blood stained the tile floor. The bodies of the dead looters had been dragged out to the edge of the front lawn. The neighborhood was entirely silent. The suburban dream was officially dead. Nash Caldwell sat in a wooden dining chair. He coughed a deep, wet rattle. He wiped his gray beard. Vance reached into his heavy canvas bag. He pulled out a plastic pharmacy bottle filled with strong amoxicillin capsules. He placed the bottle on the wooden table. Nash looked at the medicine. He opened the plastic cap. He poured 2 pills into his dirty hand and swallowed them dry. He looked up at Vance. He nodded slowly. A silent agreement was made. They were a team now. Corinne walked into the kitchen. She carried 2 heavy nylon duffel bags filled with their remaining freeze-dried food and medical trauma kits. She set them down near the shattered patio door. Silas followed right behind her. He carried the heavy blue 5-gallon water jugs. He had the hunting knife strapped tightly to his belt. He looked older this morning. The terrified teenager was gone. The raw mechanics of survival had replaced his fear. Vance looked at his wife. He told her they could not stay here. Cole was a pragmatic man. He retreated to save his own life last night, but he would return. He would bring more men and heavier weapons. The city fires on the horizon were growing larger. The flames would reach the suburban tree lines in less than 3 days. They needed to move to higher ground. They needed fresh water and isolation. Corinne nodded. She picked up a heavy black shotgun shell bandolier from the counter. She slung it diagonally across her chest. She asked Vance if the tractor had enough fuel to reach the mountains. Vance picked up his Glock 19. He ejected the magazine. He counted the remaining brass rounds. He had exactly 5 bullets left in the clip. He slammed the magazine back into the grip and holstered the weapon. He told her the diesel engine would get them 50 miles out of the dead zone. After the fuel ran dry, they would pull the supply cart by hand into the deep woods of the Appalachian Trail. They walked out of the front door together. The sun broke through the thick haze of distant smoke. The heavy green John Deere tractor sat idling in the driveway. A metal utility trailer was hitched to the back. Nash climbed up onto the rear metal platform. He rested his suppressed rifle across his knees. He watched the empty streets for any movement. Corinne and Silas loaded the heavy water jugs and canvas bags into the trailer. They strapped a thick blue tarp over the supplies using green paracord. Vance climbed up into the driver's seat of the machine. He gripped the heavy steering wheel. He looked back at the large two-story house. The white paint was stained with soot and blood. The front door was a shattered ruin. It was no longer a home. It was just a hollow wooden box in a dying city. Corinne climbed into the passenger seat beside him. She looked at the bodies on the lawn. She looked at the burning horizon. She placed her hand over his bloody knuckles. She took a deep breath of the warm morning air. She looked at Vance. She asked him what they do now. Vance shifted the heavy transmission into gear. The mechanical diesel engine roared loudly. Black smoke shot up into the gray sky. He looked directly at his wife. His voice was cold and perfectly clear over the sound of the engine. He said the old world burned to the ground yesterday. He said we make our own rules now.